The Quebec Liberation Front, or the Front de Libération du Québec, was a Marxist and Leninist parliamentary group in Quebec that operated from 1963 to 1970. The FLQ was regarded as a terrorist group within Canada, with their leader and founder being Pierre Valliere. The FLQ was founded during a period of change in Quebec, including the modernization and industrialization, but it was also fueled by factors such as decolonization of Algeria. The main goal of the FLQ was to create an independent state, much like Fidel Castro's Cuba. In the fall of 1969, two separate cells emerged within the FLQ: the South Shore Gang, also known as the Chenien Cell, and the Liberation Cell. Both cells had about 12 members.
In 1963, extremists turned to violence, marking the birth of Le Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ. The terrorists choose where Wolfe had thought himself victorious.
To the FLQ, the Bank of Montreal symbolized an Anglo-Canadian stronghold.
The National Revenue Building, the RCMP headquarters, the Canadian National Railways, the Black Watch Armory, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Queen Victoria Monument, La Grenade Shoe Factory, the Paul Sauvé Arena, Dominion Textiles, Standard Structural Steel, Eaton's, Murray Hill, Chambre de Transport, the Montreal City Hall, the Bank of Nova Scotia, the Quebec Ministry of Labour, the Canadian Army, the Montreal Stock Exchange, the Queen's...
On February 13, 1969, the FLQ bombed the northeast wall of the Montreal Stock Exchange, injuring 27 people. Its significance in Quebec is remarkable. First, it led to the charter of the French language, which meant that the language of work in Quebec would be French. In turn, more English-speaking companies turned to the Toronto Stock Exchange to do their trading.
In 7 years, 6 people were killed. Before, the Queen came to Canada, but to many French Canadians, she came as a symbol of British domination.
The FLQ was comprised of multiple cells, namely the Chenien and the Liberation Cell. And on the 5th of October, 1970, 2 members of the Liberation Cell kidnapped the British Trade Commissioner, James Cross. The Chenien Cell took him hostage and demanded detained FLQ members, also known as political prisoners, for his safe return. As well, they demanded that the CBC broadcast the FLQ manifesto on all French and English-speaking channels. And on October 8th, they received their wish. The manifesto was played on all French and English-speaking media outlets. The 14th day of October brought phone calls from 16 of Quebec's high-end individuals to negotiate for 2 hostages in return of the political prisoners. In addition, the FLQ lawyer Robert Lemieux urges the students at the University of Montreal to boycott their classes. The following day, Quebec City requests government intervention in the aid to civil power because of their rights under the National Defense Act. Meanwhile, Lemieux organized a 3,000 student rally to show support for the FLQ. Many, including Martin Chartrand, said the popular support for the FLQ was rising when he stated, "We are going to win because there are more boys ready to shoot members of parliament than there are policemen." Furthermore, Jean-Robert Bourassa requested that the War Measures Act be implemented.
They feel that even written in French, English controls the money, the power, and the force. The Mounties are the federal government's police. They too are seen as evidence that Quebec is controlled from outside. The separatists are led by people like Barbeau, Delmine, and Pierre Bourgault. They. The president of the Canadian National Railways announced that there were not enough French Canadians qualified for senior management positions. Gordon's statement enraged a francophone population, which for centuries had seen the best jobs always go to the English. The demonstrators served notice on Canada that Quebec will no longer put up with discrimination.
Finally, on the 16th of October, the War Measures Act was employed at 4 a.m., which meant the suspension of the habeas corpus. It also marked the first time that the War Measures Act was enforced during the time of peace. The next day, the most consequential day of the crisis, Pierre Laporte had been executed, stuffed in a trunk, and left near the airport. Later, the FLQ stated that they would not execute James Cross because they wanted their demands met. Their new demands were 1. Publication of the FLQ manifesto, 2. Release of 23 political prisoners, 3. An airplane to take them to Cuba or Algeria, 4. Rehiring of the Gardes de la Pomme, 5. A voluntary tax of $500,000 to be loaded on the plane prior to departure, 6. The name of the informer that had sold the FLQ activists earlier in the year.
Notwithstanding these conditions, partly because of them, it has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons just how fragile a democratic society can be if democracy is not prepared to defend itself, and just how vulnerable to blackmail are tolerant, compassionate people.
After hearing about the War Measures Act, René Levesque criticizes it. He specifically says, until we receive proof of the size of the Revolutionary Army to the contrary, we will believe that such a minute, numerically unimportant fraction is involved, that rushing into the enactment of the War Measures Act was a panicky and altogether excessive reaction, especially when you think of the inordinate length of time they want to maintain this regime.
The police raid the hiding place of the Chenier cell and arrest Bernard Lortie. Sadly, 3 members escaped. On December 3rd, after 62 days, James Cross was released because the kidnappers were satisfied with the negotiations. The FLQ received a free pass to Cuba that was approved by the Canadian government and Fidel Castro. Later in December, Trudeau announced that all troops would vacate Quebec by January 5th, 1971. The October crisis unofficially ended when 3 remaining members of the FLQ were found and arrested. The crisis also sparked a heavy support for the Parti Québécois, as the people of Quebec didn't like the violent nature of the Quebec separatists movement. The decline of the FLQ started with declining support of the public and also because of constant fear of police intervention. Also, the Montreal Anti-Terrorism Unit had many spies within the FLQ, and they eventually arrested 24 people within a span of 13 months. All of the public interest in the FLQ was muffled by many arrests that had taken place.